So thank you everybody for joining. Welcome. I hope that the morning session was good. I actually thought to myself I would probably rather be in Santa Cruz right now. I kind of lament the days of travel in some respects. I'm in cloudy, rainy Portland, Oregon right now. It's only 51 degrees, and I made the mistake of looking at the weather for Santa Cruz, and it looks like it's going to be a beautiful 73-degree day. So hope some of you guys are close to that, or at least enjoying some really nice weather. So I'm going to just kind of get started here. A few housekeeping items. The name of the session here is really about thermal screening, or the objective about it is to discuss thermal screening mostly from an educational perspective. My name is Mike Sherwood. I'm the Senior Field Solution Architect for CDW. I cover the Pacific Northwest, which basically encompasses Northern California on up through the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, Washington, and I range over to some of the states east of here as well. So my job really is to help our customers with knowledge around these various solutions that are in our enhanced video surveillance practice. So these are technologies really related to video surveillance, school safety typically. But recently there are a lot of new technologies that have come into focus, especially with COVID and all of the concerns that we have there. And one of those is thermal screening technology. So that's what our aim is to discuss that really from the perspective of what considerations should you have in mind when you're making policies around use of this technology. We don't want the technology in and of itself to drive your policy decisions. Rather, we would like you guys to come up with policy that makes sense, and then we'll back in the right technology to help support that. But we also understand that having some knowledge around the technologies can help at least inform what those policies may look like. So first off, thank you to all the sponsors. I know these events don't come together easy. There's a lot of work that happens on the back end. A lot of people put in a ton of hours and effort, including the sponsors, but also all the people behind the scenes that really make this thing tick. And in some respects, doing it in a virtual way can be even more difficult and challenging. So really appreciate everybody who's pitched in on that piece. Mine's a very small piece of that, and they've made my job incredibly simple. So I really appreciate that. A little bit of housekeeping on some of the controls that you have available to you. So you have the ability to open up this participant window, and there are some icons down here, some tools that you have that can help me a little bit in understanding how the pace is. So for example, you can click go slower or go faster if I'm moving too fast or too slow. So that gives me a little bit of information as to how I should pace myself. You can raise your hand if you'd like, or you can just type in the chat. So you can open the chat window right here. You can send it either to everyone or myself. You can send it to Butch as well. Butch is our co-host, and so he can also help here. He's moderating the session, so he can start to monitor some of these questions that are coming in. We'll probably wait till the end to answer most of them. And it looks like our group isn't massive, so we can probably open up for some verbal sharing as well. So get everybody on the line, and you can ask questions that way, make it a little bit more interactive. All right, so moving on here, we have a new normal. Your institutions that you guys work in are rapidly shifting, and we know that there's a lot that are going into the decisions that are being made to reopen schools and how that should look. There's a ton of policy that's changing around this. There are a lot of tools to be implemented, a lot of questions about how do you bring kids back in a safe way. And so at CDW, we've had this in mind. We've been monitoring various technologies that are on the market. Some of them have been available for a long time, and other technologies have just kind of emerged now, or they maybe emerged in a little bit of a different way. And I think you'll see that a little bit throughout the presentation. I'll point out how some of these technologies have been shifted from their original focus to a new focus, which is the temperature screening. So really, what is our new normal? Well, part of it is to reduce risk of exposure and transmission of COVID-19. So we know that that's a key element. We want to make folks feel safe when they come into our environment. So we want our students and parents to have confidence when their students return to school that we're doing everything we can. We know that there's not one silver bullet to this, but yet there are multiple things that we can do to help provide some of that confidence. And then there's increasing pressure to meet some state and local guidelines. And I know that California has recently released some guidelines around this. The CDC also has. So I'll touch on a few of those and what those look like pertaining to this. I was just looking at a document from Washington State yesterday, and they had some terminology in there around screening students for COVID-19 symptoms when they come into the school. So we know that that's a part of what most plans will encompass. And again, this is one element to that that can help expedite a small portion of what you guys are looking to accomplish. We do note that the CDC does recommend that temperature checks be a part of that. So when screening for symptoms, temperature is one indicator. We also know it's not the only indicator, and there are people who are asymptomatic or not showing symptoms, but still contagious because the symptoms haven't shown up yet. So just something that we should all continue to be aware of, that this is just one element in a grander scope. So what is it really about? Well, for a long time, thermal technologies have existed in cameras. Historically, we used thermal cameras to look at hotspots in data centers or to monitor machinery in a production environment. And those environments have fairly large temperature ranges. So we're talking about very broad ranges of temperature where it's easy to see a spike. If you look at a data center, for example, we know when there's a hotspot in that data center or a piece of machinery that's going from maybe 300 degrees to 350 degrees. That's a very large shift. These technologies weren't necessarily originally developed to look at human temperatures, but they've been adapted to that. As such, though, it only looks at surface temperature. So we're not able, of course, to monitor the internal temperature of somebody without having a device that does that. So these are looking at the temperature that's on the surface of the skin. So what do? Really, they help us with volume. So they help us move people through a little bit quicker. They give us some indication of if that person has an elevated temperature, and we should move them on to a secondary screening process. So it's really about getting people through as fast as we can. And when we look at school environments, that's exactly what we're trying to do when we bring students back into the fold. These devices are typically within a plus or minus 0.5 to 0.9 degree Fahrenheit range that they're detecting. So it's a fairly narrow range, yet it can result in some false positives and false negatives. So just keep that in mind as we're working through this presentation. There are some ways that we can increase the accuracy, and I'll go through those as we make our way through here. And again, just as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that these are combined with other strategies within your environment to make for the best possible solutions. We also understand that social distancing will remain an important component. Personal protective equipment, face masks, et cetera, will continue to remain important. And so there are other technologies that can start to facilitate those. For example, making sure that people have a face mask on. So there's camera analytics that can do that. We can look at occupancy of spaces, density in those spaces. So again, with analytics on video cameras. So, think about if you have cameras within your environment, the systems that those are running on, and maybe look into some options of other components that might be added to that so you can leverage your existing investment for other purposes too. So we're not going to get into those specifically in this presentation, but just be aware that they're out there and there are some options available that can help with these various solutions. So we'll touch on the FDA here for just a moment. This is an important component to understand. All thermographic cameras that are used for purposes of temperature screening on a human are considered a medical device. As such, the FDA requires this 510K clearance. That is a component that has been waived as of April of this year due to the response to COVID. In fact, there's only one manufacturer that currently has the 510K clearance. That manufacturer is FLIR. The majority of their devices have been purchased by the US government. So I think the government in response said, hey, we understand that there's a massive constraint on these devices, so let's go ahead and open it up for other manufacturers. Let's not put them through this rigorous process that we need to get the certification, but instead let's get them into the market. Now, that being said, we at CDW want to partner with companies who are at least going towards the 510K clearance. So we want them to enter into the certification process. and be in flight, because we also understand that at some point that waiver could go away. And when it does, we want to make sure that your investments are protected and you're still able to use those devices for the purpose they were intended to be used for. Because let's face it, there's not just COVID-19, but we may want to look at elevated skin temperature in other scenarios, or if there's another pandemic. Let's hope that isn't the case, but should it happen, we want to be prepared for those as well. So again, this just kind of goes back to what I said before, but it really is about scaling up for the volume. So if we look at what a camera does, it's able to look at people in a fairly fast way. I'll show you some videos of what that looks like, but you can see from the picture here on your left that there are multiple people in this image. They're coming through the field of view of a camera pretty quickly, and it's measuring their skin temperature. On the right-hand side, we have somebody measuring temperature with an handheld IR thermometer. These are held closer to the skin, so they're a little bit more accurate due to their proximity. Keep in mind, those are actually monitoring the same skin temperature as what the cameras are, so the results should be pretty close. The only way to really accurately measure temperature, and I'm no healthcare provider or healthcare professional, but certainly is a lot of knowledge around this, or a lot of information around this that we've been able to gather. But we want an internal temperature, inner ear, oral, those types of things are where we're going to get our best accuracy. So we're really in it on the volume side. That's what we're talking about. But we understand that accuracy has to be an important component of this. But this can be also handled in a secondary screening activity. And we'll talk about what that looks like and what our recommendations will be around that. So how does a thermal camera actually work? Well, it's detecting a different spectrum of light. And that light spectrum is associated with heat. Kind of see it in this graph here. We have our visible light spectrum on the left-hand side, and we have our heat spectrum on the right-hand side. So this is really where we're focused at, but we want to couple it also with the visual element of it. So in addition to seeing if somebody has an elevated temperature, it might be beneficial for us to be able to capture that individual in a regular video footage so that we can at least have that comparison point. It's not 100% necessary, because oftentimes these are manned stations where we're kind of directing traffic. Red, you come over here to secondary screening. Green, you can go in the building, it's fine. But sometimes we want to go back in time and do that visual verification. Now we also understand there could be some risks around HIPAA and so forth, and storing sensitive medical information. And so in those cases, if you choose not to do that, it's not required, it's not necessary. So none of these solutions have to be recorded to a video management system. If you have one in place today and you want to leverage that, that's fine, and there are solutions that can do that, but it is not a requirement. Again, looking at the skin surface temperature, something to be aware of in how these devices work is that when somebody comes into the field of view, if they have an extremely low reading, say they're reading 86.4 or something like this, in that case, there are algorithms on a camera that will actually raise the temperature and display something that's higher, because it's outside of a normal range. We know that humans typically operate within this kind of 2-degree threshold for a normal temperature. And what we're really most concerned about are those elevated temperatures. So in this case, the manufacturer's saying, hey, this person's reading low. We don't believe that. There's probably something else that's causing this low reading. So we're going to go ahead and bump it up, make it look good, get them through so that we can say, yeah, we agree. They at least don't have an elevated temperature. That's a pretty good solution for the most part, as long as you're following the other guidelines that I'll outline here, and how to move people through the screening and how long they need to acclimate to the indoor environment. If those measures are met, probably won't have very many scenarios where it's actually reading low. In some cases, some manufacturers actually have a sliding algorithm. So as people move through the field of view of the camera, it actually changes. So if it detects that everybody's about a degree low, then it'll shift slightly. It'll put an offset into the system where it says, okay, let's actually adjust for the temperature and move this up a little bit. That can be good in some cases, but again, you still want to follow the general principles around the design that we'll outline here in the presentation. The accuracy is not common, the accuracy is not the same across all manufacturers. Important to be aware of. Some manufacturers have been in this space for a very long time. They've been using their technology for this purpose for at least a few years. And in those cases, those manufacturers tend to have a little bit those more mature solutions tend to be a little bit more accurate. There are other manufacturers that are just now coming into the space, and they're, in some ways kind of taking advantage of what's happening. There's an opportunity there. They're fulfilling a demand. But you see things coming on the market in pretty quick time frames, and they probably need a little bit of time to mature. So you're going to see some differences in accuracy between different solutions. I'll talk about one of those solutions specifically where they've really adapted it for this purpose, where it wasn't necessarily designed for that in the first place. And then there's a calibration element. So as you start to investigate these technologies, make sure that it has the ability to calibrate. It's something you want to do somewhat frequently. Manufacturer typically specifies what that frequency is. Sometimes it's every day, sometimes it's once a week, in some cases maybe just once a month. If you have a solution that's on wheels, you're moving it around a lot, then you really need to calibrate it each time you move it, because it will be in a different environment, different ambient temperatures, different circumstances around it. So it's a really important component to remember, that you want to have somebody available that can calibrate these devices. It's a pretty simple process. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes. But it should be done on a fairly regular basis to ensure accuracy. Now, there's a lot of factors that affect thermal readings. Probably first and foremost is ambient air temperature, but that's also just the environment in general. So when we talk about ambient air temperature, of course, we have a lot of factors that come into play with that. We don't want to place a camera that's directly in front of a door, as an example, because when people open it, it's going to change the temperature of the environment pretty quickly. We don't want to be below a vent that could have the same impact. We also want to stay out of places that are directly in sunlight. So if there's a window and there's a lot of sun flooding in, that's going to warm the environment. So we want to ensure that the background behind the individual that's being checked for temperature is at a fairly constant temperature, and that it's not higher than a human body temperature, because that will impact the accuracy of the reading. That's probably the biggest one, those air fluctuations in ambient air. Again, why you also want to calibrate sometimes on a daily basis if you have large temperature shifts in your environment, or if it's highly variable based on the outside temperature or humidity even, so that can impact it. So anything above about 50% humidity, and you start to see some changes in the accuracy of the solutions, and it would require a calibration at that point. The person's distance from the thermal camera makes a big difference as well, and that depends on the camera that you're using. So much like a regular camera, there's a lens. That lens has a certain focal range on it, and that results in a number of pixels per inch that it's looking at. And so the size of the sensor that's behind it, the lens, the type of lens, those are all going to impact how far away a person can be. They typically range anywhere from as close as 18 inches for some solutions, all the way out to about 20 feet. So if you had a permanently mounted solution that's on a ceiling or a wall, that might work better at a longer distance, or you might want to select a camera that does work better at a longer distance to support that. Somebody coming in from a hot or a cold environment, or if they've been exercising, engaged in strenuous activity, they just walked to school, or they're late to school and they had to run a little bit, all those things are also going to impact it. When we come in from exercising, we have an elevated temperature, we're warmer. If we might have maybe sweating, so we've got some perspiration, and that's going to impact the emissivity of the skin, and it won't allow some of the heat necessarily to get through, so it could actually read a little bit cooler in those instances. So there's a lot of things there to consider. Go into some ways you can mitigate that and plan for it. There are other things that can also impact it. So one are if somebody's wearing glasses. So a common area that these cameras are looking at to be able to identify for elevated temperature is the inner canthus of the eye. So just in here, between right by your nose and in your eye, that's where they're looking for temperature spikes. That's the most accurate place to measure. A lot of others are looking at the forehead. Some are looking at both. So if it doesn't detect the inner canthus of the eye, then it's going to look at the forehead. A lot of the devices have some analytics built into it. So they'll actually recognize that that's a human face. So they're not going to try and measure temperature on your body. They're going to focus in, yep, that's a head, that's a face, and I'm going to take a temperature in this large area of skin right here on my forehead. So that's going to be pretty common for most of the manufacturers, and I would say that the ones that are measuring the temperature on the inner canthus are a little bit fewer. People wearing makeup can also affect this. And if you have thinner skin, you're going to be more susceptible to changes in temperature in the environment. That doesn't typically affect our younger population, but the older population, as we age, our skin starts to thin. And when that happens, it makes our temperature shift externally more quickly than it had in the past. So just keep that in mind as you're screening people, maybe in certain instances where you have guests that are coming into the building, or maybe it's for an event. You want to just be aware that that could have an impact. Again, there's some measures that we can take to mitigate against that. So what do the solutions actually look like? This is a bit of a comparison here. The way we kind of look at this is really about it's a combination of throughput and accuracy. So typically the higher the throughput, the lower the accuracy may be. The higher the accuracy, the lower the throughput. And that's not exactly true for all of these solutions, but it does kind of hold some consistency throughout. So what we'd start with is on this upper left-hand side here is this non-contact IR thermometer. So that's an inexpensive solution that you can use. It's somebody that's actually holding this device. They're scanning somebody's forehead as they come into a building, or maybe after they've acclimated to the environment for a little bit, ensuring that they don't have an elevated temperature. Those take a little bit of time, so they're fairly slow. Our estimates are that you can probably get somewhere between 5 to 10 people per minute through that scenario, and but it is going to be fairly accurate, and it's a good solution for low budget. But again, tough to move a ton of people through it. So it really depends on the circumstance and what you're using that for. The second one is also a handheld solution. It's handheld as it shows on here, but it can also be mounted on a tripod. So we see that kind of frequently, is that they'll use these devices mounted on a tripod. It's somewhat manual, but less manual, right? So it doesn't require you to necessarily pull the trigger every time. You can set it up and have it constantly running. So it does have some automatic capabilities. It has a screen that's built into it. It's pretty small, but it is effective. So as people are coming through the field of view, you'll see them in the screen. It'll show what their temperature is. It'll flag if it's elevated based on the thresholds that you've set up. So that's user-defined parameters. So it'll show red, right? This person's red, a little alarm goes off, can be audible or not, and then that allows me to be able to direct traffic from there. These operate at a closer distance, so the subject has to be 2 to 6 feet in front of it for it to get an accurate reading. It is pretty quick, or well, not super fast, but it is faster than the non-contact IR thermometer. We're estimating somewhere between 10 and 12 pulses per minute. If you look at the manuals on most of these devices, they're recommending that somebody come and they just pause briefly in front of the device before they move on. It's not really geared for an environment where people are walking quickly by it. So keep that in mind. The accuracy is pretty decent on these. We show it here as plus or minus 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit. If you add a Blackbody to it, I'll explain what that is here in a little bit. If you add a Blackbody, then your accuracy will increase. And it is possible to add Blackbodies to these devices. There's calibrations modes to accommodate that. And so that typically puts you more into like plus or minus 0.5 degree Fahrenheit range. The next solution are these kiosks. These kiosks are popping up everywhere. If you do a quick Google search for thermal scanning or fever scanning or any of those types of things, you'll see a bunch of these kiosk devices come up. There are about 3 manufacturers of these globally, but there's probably 100 different OEMs of these. So they're all coming kind of from the same place. Most of them are made in China. I think all of them are actually. They might differ a little bit on the sensors that they use. It's a different type of sensor than what the thermal cameras are using. And it's requiring the subject to be closer to the device itself. So closer to this 1 to 3 feet. Most of the manufacturers recommend something around the 18-inch range. So they have to get fairly close into it in order to be able to capture their temperature. But it is a self-service unit, right? So it's something that's kind of standalone. These were originally meant for visitor management purposes or access control. So they also do some face recognition. You can load a database of faces into it. So these could be student faces or faculty, and those can be used for other purposes like opening a door, for example, or granting access to a facility. So that's really what those were designed for. And in fact, the thermal sensor that's coupled with them is there for liveness detection. So anytime you add some type of a biometric into an access control system where I'm looking at a face and I'm using that to give somebody access to a building, I need to make sure that that person's actually alive. I don't want them to just bring in a piece of paper, hold it up with a face on it, and all of a sudden it lets them in. You need to make sure it's a real human. So in order to do that, they put these sensors in the devices to measure their temperature to make sure that it falls within the range of a human. And so that's really what those were designed for. This is a great example of some companies that have said, hey, look, our technology can be used for other things as well. It's accurate in detecting liveness, and we think it can be just as accurate in giving us a good reading on a temperature. So that's kind of what those look like. They take a little bit, again, 10 to 12 people per minute is what we're estimating on that. These are plus or minus 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit. They don't have a black body option, so it's really difficult to get too much more accurate than that. The fastest and probably most accurate solutions are the mounted thermographic cameras. These can be mounted in multiple scenarios. It can be on a wall, ceiling, it can be actually mounted to a mobile cart. These are automated almost entirely. Alerts and alarms can be sent out based on somebody exceeding a specific threshold, though we recommend that these be manned because you don't want people entering the facility if they do have elevated temperatures. So I think it's important to understand that. But they do work at a greater variety of distances, so our mounting options start to expand when we look at these types of devices, and they are faster. So our estimates are around 20 to 30 per minute. Again, the most highly accurate it's going to be is if somebody pauses in front of it, but that's not necessary. People can just kind of walk through the field of view. They need to walk in a perpendicular way to the camera, so they need to be facing straight on, kind of like I am this webcam here, so that they can actually monitor or see the full forehead. If they're kind of at an angle, they're going to get a little bit of it, but that will affect the accuracy. And I'll show you a video of what that looks like with them actually coming in at an angle. Better accuracy on these, plus or minus 0.5 is typical. You can even get as low as plus or minus 0.2 when you pair it with a Blackbody device. But in some cases, you're going to be in this, again, plus or minus 0.9, which is the FDA guidance. So these devices are submitting for FDA approval. If they meet a threshold of accuracy of plus or minus 0.9, then they will be approved in all likelihood. So for best results, I mentioned it a few times, Blackbody device. It's kind of a weird name for it, but think of it as a small radiator. It's basically a little heater that sits on a tripod or can be permanently mounted, but it provides the thermal camera with a constant reference source. So it has the same temperature all the time. It's whatever you calibrate it to. So it's usually something above a normal human temperature or close to. So maybe 105 or 104 degrees is what they're set to. And the idea is that that camera knows at all times that that black body is set to 104 degrees. It also gives me a good reference point to calibrate against. So as I move devices around, I can take the temperature of the black body to make sure that it's reading accurately. And then I set that calibration in the camera, put a little box around the black body and say, yep, this spot right here all the time is 104 degrees. So that's kind of important from an accuracy perspective if you want the best of the best. It's not required, but it is definitely something to be aware of, and it will give you better results. It does add expense to this or cost to the solution. So it is a little bit more expensive to use the Blackbody, but I think for accuracy purposes is definitely a positive addition. Oh, let me go back here. A couple things to be aware of, I think, that I should point out on this. CDC recommends that individuals acclimate to the indoor environment. This is also recommended by various manufacturers. You're going to see this vary depending on the manufacturer. So some manufacturers say that it should be 5 minutes, some say 3 minutes. CDC goes as high as 15 minutes. I think it's highly dependent upon the outdoor environment that people are coming in from. So if you're in a hot climate or a cold climate and they're coming inside, you might want to, especially if it's towards the various temperature extremes, you probably want to let them acclimate longer in the ambient temperature in the indoor environment than you would if it's 70 degrees outside. In that case, it's probably fairly close to the same as what it is inside, so it doesn't take as long for people to acclimate to that. So keep that in mind as you start to think about your policy around how you would stage people to move the people through these devices, and what that would look like to make sure that you're getting the best accuracy. Removing any head coverings, brushing hair out from in front of your forehead, all those things could be required as well. So anticipate that there's a little bit of kind of training and getting used to these systems when you first put them in. Students have to get accustomed with, to it and used to it and understand what the limitations are and kind of the behavior that they need as they're moving through it, make sure they take hats off and all those types of things. Yeah, so just a quick example of something with the Blackbody. This is a video that was taken at a trade show. You can see that we have the reference window over here on the left. So this is our constant heat source. Then we have our measurement window here. Moving on to another one. This particular one is using a height vision camera. We can see that the subjects are moving through. They're moving at an angle. This is not recommended. We would want them perpendicular to the camera, but you can see it's pretty quick. They're also not adhering to any kind of social distancing or anything like that. So we're looking at multiple people at a time in that scenario, though the CDC recommendation is that you just measure the temperature of one person at a time, that you don't have elements in the background that could skew that. So if you had a lot of people that were kind of queued up and they were queued up back behind, say me, they're back here, we wouldn't want that actually. We would want them kind of off to the side, outside of the field of view of the camera to ensure that they're not being captured in that same scene. Here's an example of kind of what the kiosks look like. One of the biggest challenges I kind of see with the kiosks in general is the height that they're at. So with a thermal camera, we're able to mount this, say, maybe at a 5.5 foot height, somewhere in that range, maybe even a little bit lower in some cases, but we can tilt it at an angle. And when we do so, we can get people that are a bit shorter. If we do it high enough, we get people a little taller. So our area of view is a little bit wider. So we have to do less to accommodate for variances with height. And I can see that being, problematic in school environments, especially where you have a wide range of heights for individuals. So I think that's something to be aware of. It doesn't make the kiosk solution, it doesn't invalidate it. Of course, there's always ways around these things. You can put a step stool in front of them. There are all kinds of creative ways I'm sure that we could figure out to use these. But if you're a bit taller person, you probably have to bend down. If you're shorter, you have to find some way to get up to it. So that's just something to kind of be aware of. These take a little bit longer to actually do the scan, maybe a couple seconds versus just walking through the field of view with a thermographic camera. But the acclimation remains the same. So we still want people to acclimate to the environment for 5 minutes or so. We want to make sure that these devices especially aren't in direct sunlight, that they're kind of have a similar ambient temperature as what the thermographic cameras do. These do have additional features as far as facial recognition goes, so they can be tied into access control systems, visitor management. So there's other things that these can be used for. Could also be a good solution for visitors that are coming into school where I don't need the same throughput that I would have with the regular thermographic camera. So here's kind of an example of how we see a typical screening process. A lot of the schools that I've talked to are a bit challenged with this piece of it, really, because it requires some space. So we've talked about what are some options that are available for people to be able to be staged for this type of screening. Could be in an environment like a cafeteria or a gymnasium. These are various ideas that have kind of been put out there. It may be that we want to have different entry points into the building, different choke points, and multiple cameras to kind of increase our throughput and help segregate different populations of students. But the idea really is that you have this indoor environment that they're able to acclimate in, and then some type of a way that we kind of move them through this indoor queue. And then after the queue, they round out to the camera. So again, the camera is not facing back towards the crowd here. It's kind of on its own. Ideally, it would have some kind of a background here. This temperature of this background should be fairly steady. Same with the ambient air temperature in that environment. So they're going to come around, briefly maybe pause here or just kind of walk up towards the camera. And then here's where we recommend that you have somebody that's managing the device. And this is why, because as somebody walks in front of it, we could put a screen in front of them that says, you're good to go, right? But that also puts that information out there for everybody else to see. So in many cases, instead, we're saying, hey, let's man this. Let's make sure that people are able to direct traffic properly, and that they, so that they can direct traffic when people have an elevated temperature. So if it's elevated, then we have a recommendation that you set up a secondary screening area. This is where you're going to use a thermometer like an inner ear or an oral thermometer to double check and see if it's actually true or not. If they're good to go, then they just make their way into the building. There's probably some education that goes around this too with the student population, and there's privacy and so forth. There's going to be questions about why is that person going off to this area and I don't have to, or so on. So these are just some things that have come up in various conversations as I've been part of these discussions, that there are policies that you want to think about how you kind of educate the student population around this. The other thing that has really been weighing on me a little bit and trying to understand how to best conquer this, I don't have the perfect solution for, but I'm hoping that as you guys put your heads together, you'll come up with this. But it's how do we deal with buses? Because we know that there are a lot of students that typically ride the bus. It may not always be possible or easy to social distance on that. I know there's some talk with different school districts about how to address it, maybe splitting up the school day so that we have fewer people that are on the bus every other day, coupled with distance learning. So there are a lot of options around that. But in my opinion, as you start to bring kids into the school for temperature screening, we want to keep those populations of students that are on the same bus together, ideally. That way, if one student registers with a high temperature that was on that bus, then we may want to segregate some of the other students too, right? Especially, or at least use that group to do some contact tracing. So was there any student that really came in close contact with or other students on the bus? If so, what does that look like? And then we can make educated decisions from there. We can have our healthcare providers that are in the school, our professionals, help to make those decisions and determine what should be done from that point forward. So these are the solutions that we've chosen to partner with. We've gone through a fairly extensive vetting process on these. It wasn't something that came easy for us, to be honest with you. We spent a lot of time researching all the options available. We pulled from a lot of knowledge that we have internally for these cameras that we've used in the past for other purposes. So that I think that helped by quite a bit. We leveraged some of our knowledge around Blackbodies and how those interact with the devices. And that kind of helped gave us a little bit of a guidance as we move through this. And really what it came down to for us were, we wanted to have a wide enough variety of solutions to give good options. But at the same time, we wanted to narrow it down a bit so that we made sure we were providing the best options. The ones that were the most accurate, that seemed to have the most relevance to the technology or to the purpose, the use case that we're looking at here. And so this is kind of where the list we came up with. From a thermographic camera perspective, Mobotics, FLIR, Aerocon, Hikvision. Probably seeing the most with Mobotics and Hikvision at the moment. Something to be aware of with Hikvision is that they do come with a little bit of what I call political baggage. So they're a Chinese manufacturer. They have been their devices have been banned from government installations or for government contracts, federal government that is. So just keep that in mind. I'm not sure how that's going to play out futuristically or how that might end up, but that is something to acknowledge. Also with Hikvision, though, you can put in standalone solutions, and that's typically my recommendation there. There have been some concerns around cybersecurity with those devices if they're on your network. So best, even though they've kind of rectified some of those concerns, I think it's probably best to use those in a standalone way. If you want to connect it to a video management system using something like a Mobotics or a FLIR in some cases, Aerocon might be a better option. But Hikvision, all in all, and one of the reasons we left it on the list, because they're fairly accurate. They have a very good track record in this. Their devices are used in China for the same purpose, have been for several years, so they have a pretty good reputation. And in some independent third-party testing that we've looked at, especially when paired with a Blackbody, and they have some of the best accuracy on the market. So it is still very relevant, even with kind of the political baggage that comes along with it. Thermal screening kiosks, again, these are all kind of very similar. We looked at different manufacturers because what does differ between them is the software. So there are different feature sets in the software. Some of them come with features like mask detection and those types of things. It's great for standalone environments. Somebody walks up to a door, the door is locked, it looks at their face, says, hey, you're not wearing a mask, we're not going to open the door for you. In some testing, those have been defeated. You put your hand over your face and it kind of looks like a mask. So these technologies aren't perfect, but they get you a little bit closer. So we're partnered with 4 companies on this in this space, and then we also have services to help with installation. They can do site surveys. We can have folks come out and actually look at the environment if it's a permanently mounted solution, or if you're looking just for some help on assembling a cart and putting some of those together. There are services that can be coupled with that to make that work. A good example of what a cart solution looks like is here on the left, bottom left. This is with a robotics camera on it. It can be used with any of these camera manufacturers. This is a medical grade cart, actually. There are some other options that are not medical grade, which work just as well. But this gives you a nice solution with wheels. It can be powered or not. The powered option is kind of nice because it's on a battery. I can move it wherever I want. I'm not, beholden to having a power outlet close by. But with the non-powered options, you just have to take it where you want it, plug it in. Again, still very portable so that you can address a variety of different situations. What comes to mind for me there are different events within a school, right? So if I have a play, maybe there's a basketball game, anything that's indoors where I might want to look at people's temperature before they enter the facility, or as they come into the facility, or as they're kind of staged to come into the environment. Yeah, perfect. I think that something on wheels is a nice solution. You can kind of move these kiosks around in the same way, maybe put it on a cart, wheel it around. They do have to be plugged in. They're not cordless in any way, right? The devices themselves are wireless, but they have to be plugged in order to operate. So just kind of keep that in mind. Some of them can be wall mounted for more permanent installations. So, this is really what it all kind of boils down to is what do you need to do to get started in this? What are those things that you should be considering and looking at? What's important to understand both with the technology, but more importantly, what your policies are. So that's really what it comes down to on the left-hand side is really what are your policies? Do you require kind of a record of the screening results? So some people want to keep a log that shows anything, maybe just people that kind of failed the screening or read as a higher temperature. Some people want everything, right? So there could be some instances where that's important to be able to go back and look historically at who has had an elevated temperature, and maybe that can help with contact tracing and understanding, as other people might show elevated temperatures, kind of how that's moving within the environment. So it could be interesting to do that, not required, but we would want to know that. Image capture, personal privacy, concerns. What are those? What are those concerns? I think that's where an element where engaging somebody like a CDW or a partner that has some knowledge around these solutions can kind of help guide and help understand what your policy is around privacy, and then what technologies do we need to implement in order to support that policy. Image retention, goes into that. FDA clearance, do you care or not? I mean, those are all important things to consider. Then we go into this people and process side. This is really when we start looking at questions like throughput. How many people do you need to move through? How much time do you have to do it? How are they entering the building? You have multiple choke points. Is there just one? All those things are going to be elements that we want to consider to find the right solution that gets people through in the right amount of time. Knowing who's going to monitor the screening process is also important. The secondary screening, how that's set up, where it's set up, who's manning that piece of it. So those are all things that should be considered in your people and processes. And then how do you handle it when it is positive? And this is kind of the more sensitive area, and this is where some education probably comes into play with the student population, other individuals. Let's make sure that we have some way to be able to handle that, that we're able to message it in the right way and talk to people about, health and safety and why we do these types of things. And then we need to identify people who are going to calibrate, support the system just in general. Of course, some support mechanisms can come from third parties like CDW, for example. But the daily calibration or weekly calibration, however frequent it is that you need to do that, should be handled by a member of your staff. It's fairly simple to do. So, most people can be, I would say pretty much anybody can be trained to do that. It's just a few steps, a few clicks of the mouse, maybe 5 or 6. Take a temperature here, set an offset over here. So I think that those are fairly easy things to accomplish, but there's a training element that needs to be coupled with this so that when you do install these, somebody's coming along, whether it's your internal staff or somebody from a third-party partner, somebody's coming in to help train the staff that's going to use it on a daily basis on how to calibrate and run the technology. And this is kind of where CDW can step in and help a lot with the technology side. But we would need some questions answered, right? Are these going to be permanently installed? Are they going to be on a cart? Do you need something that's highly mobile or kind of mobile? Those are important things that we would want to know. Do you want it to interface with your current video management system? If so, what is that system? Those are things that we would have to know in order to make sure that we're helping you make the right decision on the type of technology that you're implementing, the right cameras, et cetera. And in all cases, we really recommend a proof of concept. So, just starting off with one of these, I think is a good idea. It gives you a good idea of how it works, what the throughput might look like on that, and then kind of informs the decisions moving forward. So, going in and saying, hey, I'm going to buy 50 mobile cards tomorrow because I think that's what I need, might not be the best idea. Let's start off with one or two. Let's kind of test it out. Maybe we test it without students at first, and let's just see how it goes. Get our arms wrapped around how the technology works and how we might want to deploy it, and then we can make a more informed decision moving forward. Tons of other, I kind of mentioned this. This is back to work, but this also I think applies to back to school, so I kind of left it in here. Things like occupancy tracking, algorithms on cameras for social distancing, heat maps. You can see on the bottom left here, there's kind of a heat map of where people have been within this environment. It can help you with sanitization. So if I know that there's an area that gets a lot of traffic, maybe I want to focus my efforts in sanitizing that area. There's some things around contact tracing. So there's other technologies that can be discussed too, not so much in the purview of this presentation, but just in general. So yeah, that I think concludes the formal presentation part of this. I do want to encourage you guys to take down this web address here. If you could go here and fill out the feedback, this is extremely helpful. So I'm hoping that I get this feedback too, and there's some areas for you to add comments to that. Would love to know how I did and where I can improve. Always looking for ways to get better at doing these things. So I would really appreciate any feedback you guys have there. It would be super helpful for me. So take the time there. It looks like Butch has also put it in the chat here, so you can just copy and paste that, which I think is fantastic. And from here, I say we can open up for Q&A. But should we unmute, do you think, here?
Sure. Did you unmute everyone?
I'm gonna
He
do it
knows
right
that.
now.
I don't know.
A little bit.
He doesn't seem like he knows that much about
Okay.
either.
So yes, I have unmuted everybody now. And so you can feel free to ask questions. You can mute yourself. Some of you are still muted because you've probably manually done that. That's fine. So maybe if you want to unmute and ask a question, you can, or otherwise you can also type in the group chat here. I'm not sure how much time we have for this. But...
We're about only just a minute or so left. It's
okay.
At 10:25. The next one starts at 10:35. So
okay. Well, maybe we can take a couple minutes here if anybody has anything specifically.
Hey, Mike, quick question on the thermal accuracy issue.
Yeah.
So I know I think you said at some point during the presentation that letting the subject acclimate to an indoor setting is preferable on one methodology, but is that also true on just the standard, like hold the thermo gun up to the forehead outside as the kid gets dropped off?
Yeah, it is. Because the IR technologies in a standard handheld thermometer are very similar, right? It's measuring the same thing. It's the surface temperature of your forehead. So those same attributes would apply to that scenario. You might see a little bit better accuracy with it, but I think in general, you want the subject to probably acclimate to the environment before you take their temperature with those. I've had some schools say, hey, we'll just give all our bus drivers one of these handheld IR thermometers, have them, scan the kid before they get on the bus. And certainly it could be an option, right? That could be one element. But I'm not sure that it quite gives you the accuracy because there's a lot of variables there. If the student's been wearing a hat because it's a cold day, or not, and it's a cold day or a hot day, all those things are still going to impact the surface temperature of the skin and could result in readings that are not accurate.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing.
any other questions from anyone before Mike gets prepared to do this again for the next group here?
I had a quick question. I'm sorry, I was kind of in and out, but I was listening to, these solutions. Do you think the budgets are going to allow, is there going to be separate distance funding to obviously doing something at a school where you have 16 points of entry? having a thermal scanning system that can do 20, 30 per minute is obviously the most ideal. But if those goes up to 20 grand a pop, you know, are we going to do like kind of a lean on me and chain the fences around the school except for one point of entry and kind of let filter people in that kind of a way, or, you know, and is that a viable solution for school districts, especially in Santa Cruz?
I don't know that I could specifically state if it is in Santa Cruz or not. I mean, I've had a lot of discussions with the various school districts, and that's a topic of conversation that comes up every time, right? Do we need to cover every entry? Should we have choke points? I mean, most of the time, I think they're looking at taking temperatures just at the beginning of the school day. Again, that's going to be based on what your policy is. And in that case, probably just a couple of choke points, maybe 2 or 3 in the larger schools, high school, for example, that might have, you know, 1,800 students or 1,000 students. When you get into smaller schools like an elementary, I think those become a little bit more reasonable to expect that we can just have one and still move our students through it in a quick enough time.
That makes sense. Thank you. That was very informative.
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay, thank everyone for attending this first session. Once again, over in the chat, I put a link to the schedule. So if you have any questions on the next sessions coming up for that. And also, please do remember to fill out the raffle. It's not just good, not the raffle, the evaluation. It's not just good information for Mike and the other presenters, but it does put you in for the raffle for some of the prizes and things like that. So you get a chance at the end of the day, take that evaluation and fill it out.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Hey, Greg, Rishi.
Take care, Mike.
Take care.